everyone, and welcome back to the SME Assembly. Shona Murray here, and for those of you just joining us, I'd like to reintroduce our next session on Channel 1, entitled The Impact of COVID-19, Challenges and Opportunities for SMEs, Society and Policy in Europe. And we'll focus on the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on SMEs and discuss what the strategic response by government and businesses should be, particularly if we're about to meet our ambitious target that the EU has set itself of carbon neutrality by 2050. Now, earlier, we heard from Maya Goppel this morning about the role that SMEs can play in building a world of well-being, inclusion and equality, and really what that might look like. And so we asked you to go away and discuss amongst yourselves how SMEs could be drivers in the transition towards a sustainable economy. So first, let's hear what you discussed in the networking rooms. And Vibke, I'll go to you first. What was your main takeaway from the blue networking room?
Great. Thank you, Shona. So one of the things that was really coming up from the conversations was that many SMEs across Europe are still suffering from the results of the COVID pandemic. And it is hard for them to rethink about rebuilding their business and considering sustainability. At the same time, we also heard that this doesn't have to be a contradiction, that it's not about rebuilding the business on the one hand and rebuilding it in a green way on the other hand. These are not two separate things. We've heard that the planet is our home and that sustainability is becoming increasingly important for competitiveness of SMEs all over. And we've also heard how important it is to look for where the good ideas are coming from. And particularly participants that I've heard from stressed that there's a lot of smart thinking in universities that can be drivers of innovation. And the young generation is coming onto the labor market with a lot of motivation, with a lot of good ideas. And let's make sure we profit from that. Sandra, what have you heard in your group?
Yes, thank you, Wiebke. So in my group, there was the put the purpose first idea. So, and the idea of thinking in systems and in ecosystem was discussed. So not to have simple ideas there and from this and from that idea, and to rethink old strategies, old ideas. So not to say when we are back in 2019, so what can we do to stronger the systems and to have a new form of economy? And I find it interesting that so I want to find ways for the young people to take this serious. So I like to find ways to give them the idea. So to force them to think in these systems and to use their ideas to help the systems. Yeah. And now I give back to Shona.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Vibke. Thanks for those insights. It's really important for us to know exactly what you, the delegates, are thinking. But I'm now delighted to introduce our eminent academics who will share with us their assessment of the impact of COVID on SMEs and the policy that supports their growth. As usual, we really want to hear from you, so please post any of your questions for the experts on the Q&A chat, and please state your name, what you do, and who you'd like to address the question to. But it's now my great pleasure to introduce Professor Frederick Welter, President of IFM Bonn. The floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I put my short intervention under an Albert Einstein quote. In the midst of every difficulty lies a great opportunity. And I basically want to share a few thoughts from our research on how to build back better and moving towards the society as outlined by Dr. Maya Goppel this morning. I want to touch on 3 points. One is, why do we need SME diversity and heterogeneity? Second, SME as change makers, so touching on the opportunity side of the crisis. And third, why do we need SME policies to adapt in different ways, or what kind of SME policies do we need? Let me come to the first point. We know from research we've done, and we've said that again and again, diversity of SME matters. We have a tendency, and I do think that we academics are part of that conversation, to focus on what we call the 1%ers, the gazelles, the high growth, the Silicon Valley models of entrepreneurship, etc., while our reality out there consists of the 99%, the micro ones, the solo entrepreneurs, the medium-sized family businesses existing for 500 years, and so. This diversity is very much important, and it actually has gained importance throughout the COVID crisis. The others, these 99% matters. Let me just illustrate that with one quick example. Solo entrepreneurs very often are seen as precariat. No, they are the new reality of what constitutes entrepreneurship, because in my own country, Germany, roughly 60% are solo entrepreneurs. They may not create many jobs, but what they do is that they add value to what constitutes entrepreneurship, because they make it more commonly, they make it more everyday, they make it more common to our lives. SMEs are highly impacted by the crisis, but they do contribute to us overcoming this crisis as well. They contribute to economic stabilization because they hold on to their employees as long as possible. They contribute to societal cohesion because they actually pronounce commitment, reliability by holding on to employees. And every entrepreneurial activity has a societal component. Directly, that may be social entrepreneurship, but also indirectly, because by producing apprentices, by actually offering jobs, by actually offering goods and services, they do contribute to our society. The question I do have here, the crisis impact on SMEs goes far beyond economic figures, job loss of SMEs. So what do we actually lose in our societies when we lose the SME diversity? That will have a negative impact on how our societies develop and how we can actually take them towards sustainable and resilient societies and economies. So do we pay sufficient attention in the current crisis to these aspects? I will briefly come back to that when I talk about policy. My second point, SME as change makers. In a way, the pandemic is a push, and when we talk about how do we need to develop SMEs entrepreneurship, also our own research and also our advice to policymakers. Because what we see is that the crisis opens up opportunities. We just heard from the breakout rooms that it's very difficult for SME owners to realize that there are opportunities out there. Because at the moment, the short-term crisis strategies dominate, like retrenchment, perseverance, sometimes outright despair, what I hear when I talk to SME owners. But we also have seen that the crisis pushes very many entrepreneurs out of their comfort zone. They proactively and creatively search for solutions. They change business models, create new communities where they help each other. They kind of offer solidarity, and they get solidarity from the society. SMEs with unique products, for example, we've seen here Mittelstand businesses offering worldwide products. They kind of remodeled their business and kind of looked for where is the opportunity within that. So what we see is Schumpeterian entrepreneurship as its best. And I think it's the question for policymakers. How can they actually capitalize on what's been seen in the crisis? How can SME policy help to SMEs to create their own future, our future? How can they sustain the diversity of SMEs? I have two main points here. When I look at SME policy making in my own country, and also what I know from international policy making, there is a policy cycle I see throughout the crisis. And what I see at the moment, that this policy cycle, SME policy making, is very much still in crisis mode itself. I can see different stages of policy making we need to help SMEs achieve their future building. First, phase one, business relief measures. Second, economic recovery policies, very often demand-oriented. Third phase, and that's the most important phase, structural change policies, and accompanying that are regulatory policies, because there is so much which can be done by regulatory adjustments. What we see in this crisis is that this is not a policy cycle where one stage builds on the other, but actually there is a cycle of going back between the different phases. But what we also see is that policymakers very often get stuck in phase one policies, like the immediate business relief measures. Why? Because we also come to recognize that there is a staggered crisis impact. So initially healthy businesses and initially healthy sectors are all of a sudden now impacted by the COVID crisis, which means that policies all of a sudden has to go back and actually think up new business relief measures, while their task also should be like offering a longer term blueprint. We also see that the crisis is a catalyst for structural change, and the crisis is speeding up structural change. And I think here is a task both for academics, because we need to know much more about what's happening here with the speeding up structural change. We have discussions around globalization versus renationalization SME value change. Do we really want that? I don't think we can draw back, actually put back the clock, but we need to acknowledge what will happen if we do this, because it will impact SMEs in another region of the world, and it might actually also impact local suppliers in our own countries. The solo entrepreneurship I touched upon at the beginning versus bigger small businesses, kind of we need to tailor maybe support more to solo entrepreneurship, but we need to acknowledge that solo entrepreneurship is not, as I said up front, precarious entrepreneurship, but it's more modern, a modern face of entrepreneurship. But the COVID crisis as catalyst for structural change, I think, is way more important if we want to achieve a blueprint for a new society and new economy, where we can basically realize the full potential of what SMEs can contribute, not only today, but after the COVID crisis. So what we need to make sure is that we can actually capitalize on the Schumpeterian entrepreneurship, but that we don't introduce a pick the winner strategy. Because I'm coming back to my first point, all SMEs matters, and SME diversity matters a lot. So those are the 3 points I briefly want to bring to the table, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that contribution, Professor Friederike Welter. I'll now ask Professor Arne Sauka, Professor and Director of the Centre for Sustainable Business at Stockholm School of Economics in Riga. You have the floor, Professor.
Thank you, and good morning. May I please ask for slides? So do we have slides? Yes. Thank you. We can switch to the next slide already. Thanks. So I will use my 5 minutes to make some suggestions on how to support SMEs during the COVID-19 crisis, drawing on 2 sources. The first source is part of my job that is devoted to interactions with policymakers, industry, and NGOs in Latvia and other EU countries. And this mainly includes involvement in various entrepreneurship and SMEs-related policy activities, project work, and alike. Next slide, please. So my observations from these activities, first of all, seem to suggest that it looks like business has become more local. So especially during the COVID-19 crisis, perhaps there is a potential for the policymakers to support local SMEs by creating platforms to deliver locally made goods to the local customers. On the other hand, for sure, exporting still matters. So supporting export growth for SMEs, all SMEs, by the way, all those that are willing or interested in or are has potential to do exporting, seem to remain amongst the top priorities, especially in smaller countries where basically the growth via exporting is more or less the only way to grow. There also seems to be potential to develop a circular economy that is via community-based giving and taking. Many goods can find second-time users, which is important in the current context when it is not always easier and cheaper to produce new goods and as compared to repairing and redistributing existing goods. So more involvement of SMEs in circular economy will most probably also lead to more of a green economy. Further, with economic downturn that comes with COVID-19, we can expect increase of the shadow economy, especially in industries such as construction and tourism that are major contributors to many EU country GDPs and are also very dependent on economic cycles. Many SMEs are directly or indirectly dependent on these industries as supporters of products or services, which is another reason to support these. industries. Then we also see that in some cases, when support mechanisms are provided to SMEs, problems are in fact postponed, not solved. So, for instance, SMEs might be offered to take a tax holiday for 6 to 12 months, but then should continue paying taxes as usual after this period. In addition, also to pay these postponed payments, and we sort of probably assume that COVID-19 might not be over in 12 months, so we can expect problems with such approach. Sometimes we also see that policy decisions are made without considering a context. For example, government of Latvia currently is planning to close some special tax regimes that are crucial for SMEs and self-employed, and that in fact were opened back in 2008 as a response to the deep recession. Then support for entrepreneurship within specific groups should not be neglected, I guess, as some groups such as women and immigrants are experiencing even more pressure during the COVID-19 crisis. And finally, when it comes to this part, arguably, COVID-19 also causes additional stress. So I believe that more than ever, SMEs would appreciate platforms for networking and problem sharing. Such platforms might also be a place where new cooperation and business emerge. So if we could go to the next slide, the second source is a survey of key foreign investors in Latvia that was implemented earlier this year. And even though these are big companies we're talking about and that we were interviewing, they still talk about some issues that are as relevant for SMEs. For instance, investors emphasize the necessity for smart government spending targeted to reducing unemployment and also requalification of employees. The key emphasis here is not on investing, is on investing, not spending to heat up economy. And this is as relevant to SMEs, I guess. They also emphasize the necessity to reduce administrative burden in order to access available support mechanisms. That for sure is important for SMEs. Next slide, please. The recommendations also include reducing tax burden, especially VAT tax, but also supporting industries with paying social tax and real estate taxes. Furthermore, investors point to what we actually teach the first-year students, that it is cheaper and often also more efficient to make investment during the economic downturn, not when the economy goes up. So both for small and bigger companies, investments in soft and hard infrastructure will most likely also pay off when the crisis is over. And finally, investors suggest to target available support mechanisms to foster local consumption, as well as support the HoReCa sector. And you can see some of this quotes from the interviews with the investors also on the screen. So thank you very much. This is all for me.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Arne Sauka. We'll now give the floor to Professor David B. Odrich, Emeritech Chair of Economic Development and Director of the Institute for Development Strategies, Indiana University.
Thank you very much, Shona. My colleague and friend, Friederike Welter, started us off this morning by reminding us of Einstein. Well, I think I'll start us off by referring to the great novelist Tolstoy, who one time observed that every happy family is the same, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own unique way. And, you know, that may be true for SMEs during upturns. Every upturn seems to be the same for SMEs. They generally thrive. SMEs are miserable and struggle in the crises, but each crisis seems to be unique in its own unique way. Well, but one thing for sure, all crises are tough on SMEs, and this crisis is no different. So I want to make 4 points in my remarks. And the first is that we know, not just from this crisis, but from the previous crises over the decades from research, that the sustainability, the ability of the SMEs to survive, is much lower than their larger counterparts, and it's lower in a crisis than it is when times are good. There's a shift away from SMEs to the larger enterprises during a crisis. The There's also, as Friederike implied, there tends to be a more of a focus, a priority from policies during a crisis on the large employers, certainly not on the smallest employers, which if you go to one-person firm, self-employed, there's not a lot of employment per enterprise. So the odds are stacked against the SMEs in a crisis. My second crisis builds on what was just reported in the previous section, and Friederike also referred to, which is the crisis poses not just a threat, but also an opportunity to move into a future in a new way, a different way to meet the future. What research has found that I've been part of is that the response to the crisis, there's really been three types of responses by SMEs. Some SMEs are drivers. They're kind of leading the way of change. Some are maintainers. That is, they don't do a lot different. And some are resistors. Well, you can guess which ones do better. It's better to be a driver than a maintainer, and the worst is to be a resistor of change. There's a particular change or a way of moving to the future that seems to be particularly conducive to sustainability for SMEs, and that has to do with digitalization. The Institute for Mittelstand's research, the IFM in Bonn, of which Friederike is the president, they found through very systematic, careful research, they've identified a kind of a digital divide. Now, we've been talking about the digital divide for years, but that was about people. What they've identified is there's also a digital divide for SMEs. And those SMEs that are able to adopt digital tools, use digital tools, they have they're much more sustainable than those that don't. My third point is that policy plays a key role. If you go back to the previous crisis, the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, it hit all countries in the West, in Europe, really hard. But one country did a little bit better or quite a bit better, really, than some of the others, and that was Germany. And we've done research on this and found that it was partly reflected the policies of helping the SMEs, in particular the coveted Mittelstand that Friederike referred to, helping them to get through the crisis. And this was through a series of specific instruments to enable them to be more flexible in terms of workforce, in terms of wages, in terms of technology adoption. And this flexibility enabled the SMEs, the Mittelstand, to weather the storm of that crisis, and therefore the country to really come out of the crisis stronger than it had gone into the crisis. Well, this crisis, is a different crisis, but it's still a storm. There's a lot that policy can do, and one is to enable and facilitate digitalization, and the other is to facilitate resilience in the SMEs. So let me conclude by echoing what we've heard, which is SMEs are the backbone of every European country. They're the backbone of every European society. Therefore, they're the backbone of Europe. And if the SMEs don't weather the storm of this crisis, it will be very tough for all of Europe to weather the storm. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Aldrich. And just a reminder, delegates, please do send in your Q&As for the professors, which we'll have in a few moments' time. Now, can I give the floor to Professor Alfredo de Masis, Professor of Entrepreneurship and Family Business at the Free University of Bolzano.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the nice invitation. Yes, I would like to share here some findings from my research on SMEs. And in particular, I would like to share with you what I believe are 5 key challenges that have been brought by the COVID-19 pandemic. And these are, 5 challenges that refers to areas where policymaking attention, in my view, is particularly needed. So the first one relates to generational transitions. We know in Europe that SMEs, as David Oders has just reported, are the backbone of the economy. We know that in Europe, more than 60% of the companies, of the workforce, is employed by SMEs. We know at the same time that business leaders, SMEs leaders, are pretty old. Actually, almost half of them are over 60. And we know that generational transitions is becoming an issue due to a number of, the aging crisis and a number of factors. Now, what happens is that, so far we have been used to think about succession as a long process that, requires times and needs to be methodically planned and executed. This pandemic, unfortunately, due to demographic challenge, due to the heightened awareness of mortality experienced by business leaders, has somehow accelerated succession. So we will be facing, a massive wave of generational transitions, and this transition will be rapid and in many cases will be unexpected. So I think it will be important for policymakers to focus their attention on, how to best support such generational transition. Another important aspect refer to, internal and external relationships, so within and among SMEs. Now, here, as already been anticipated by my distinguished colleagues, we know that typically SMEs have a local business model. We know that the competitive advantage of an SMEs is very often lies in their superior capacity of building up long-lasting personal relationships with the external and the internal actors. Now, again, this pandemic has brought some challenge because, we know that we have been experiencing social distancing. We know that we have been exposed, to working from home, smart working, and all these smart working routines, lead to a potential risk of dehumanizing such relationships. And dehumanizing these unique relationships that are at the heart of the competitive advantage of an SME, risks to jeopardize their distinctive social capital and also, to destroy somehow a potential source of competitive advantage. So again, I think that policy-making attention is needed in order to understand how in the new normality we can redesign the working activities of SMEs so as to ensure that on the one hand we can leverage on digitalization and on smart working practices, while at the same time preserving, this unique personal social capacity of building social relationship of SMEs. A third area refers to the goals of the entrepreneurs and of the leaders of SMEs. Because one effect of this pandemic has been that, many, as already anticipated also by Frederic in the opening speech, there is an important social component of entrepreneurship that has been resurrected during this pandemic. What I'm saying is that we have been seeing in different countries across Europe how many family firms and many SMEs have been, prioritizing society-centered goals. Some SMEs have started producing like facial masks, have converted their productions, etc. Now, what is the challenge here? The challenge, in my view, is that these leaders have experienced these negative emotions, for example, due to isolation, due to the physical and emotional vulnerabilities that they have been living. And this is leading now to tensions among different goals, among economic goals and non-economic goals, among goals centered around society and goals centered around, for example, the family, if we consider, for example, the Mittelstand firms. And so here again, I see, an important area of attention needed from policymakers in order to understand how this trade-off among different goals that have appeared and have been, especially salient after the pandemic, can be managed, can be resolved. I'm thinking, for example, about the trade-off of health versus wealth, life versus livelihood, business utility versus utility for society and or for the family. So this is another area. Another area is related to the long-term orientation of SMEs and to their, propensity to look, to be forward-looking. I mean, this was a key assumption up to the pandemic. We were thinking that entrepreneurs in SMEs were really, forward-looking, and in most cases we were giving for granted the intention to grow over generations. Now that we are living in a very uncertain and difficult, problematic time, we know that each of us is looking more and more will positivize the golden age of the past. And I think that the negative future outlook and the increasing uncertainty of the current environment leads SMEs leaders to become backward-looking, to become oriented probably to survival rather than growth. And so again, here I think that policymakers have a unique opportunity to catalyze attention on how we can at the same time preserve their past, preserve the past, the tradition that we have across entrepreneurial activities in Europe, while at the same time, pushing these companies to become innovative, because of course innovation will be needed in the new normal. And so, recombining, or let's say being able to innovate through tradition or to manage the balancing between innovation and tradition will be another key area. And finally, to conclude, a last challenge refers to the assets and to the patrimony of the SMEs across Europe. Before this pandemic, I think that most of us, as entrepreneurship and management scholars, we have been giving for granted somehow that the patrimony of a company or, the assets of an entrepreneur are somehow, given. In some way, for example, if we consider family firms, we used to say that family firms have a patient capital. So they're not really looking forward. I mean, they're not liquidity issues. Now the pandemic has brought some challenge because economic downturn, cash challenge, new type of risks that we have been seeing during this pandemic have increased the salience of asset and liquidity issues for SMEs. And so I see, a lot of attention to combine the management and governance perspectives that we have been embracing so far with the patrimonial one. Because when I talk, even in my Center for Family Business with SMEs leaders and owners, too often now they are mentioning, my main issue is how can I make sure that we don't destroy during this crisis our liquidity, our patrimony. And so again, this is another unique area of attention that it's particularly needed. With this, I conclude, and I thank you all for the attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor de Massis. And now Professor Ute Stephan, Professor of Entrepreneurship at King's College London. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. If I could have my slides as well, please. Hopefully they're coming. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. Yes, there they are. I wanted to give you just some glimpses and paint a bit of a global picture of how SMEs have been doing in the COVID pandemic. You see, we've done a project at the height of the pandemic, really surveyed SMEs in 22 countries, and these 22 countries make up just about 3/4 of the world GDPs and cover more than half of the world's population. If I could have the next slide, please. And so just to give you some glimpses of the over 3,000 SMEs in our study, yes, they are suffering. So 3 in 4 report a loss in trading, 63% see the very existence of their business threatened by COVID. And if you ask them how much liquidity they have, the survival prospects are quite dire as well. So on average, 8 months. And there is some variation across countries, but sadly, the picture is quite homogeneous of really dire prospects. If I could have the next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so it's not just the entrepreneurs, businesses who suffer, the SMEs that are suffering, it's also the entrepreneurs themselves. And that may be an obvious point to make, but I just want to reiterate, compared to pre-crisis level, what we see here, the blue is the COVID level, so that's the drop in life satisfaction in some countries, quite dramatic, but even a little drop in life satisfaction is problematic. Why is this problematic? Because we know from a lot of research that entrepreneurs' well-being is a really important source of their resilience. It is so important for their forward-looking actions. And the flip side is low well-being is actually a very real threat to the business because mental health issues have quite high mortality rates in themselves. So the entrepreneur's well-being, when we're talking a lot about how the business is affected, I think we also should kind of bear in mind how much the entrepreneurs themselves were affected and try to deliver support there. If I could have the next slide, please. But however, the picture is not entirely bleak. So we've heard about opportunities, and one thing we see is that actually the entrepreneurs are long-term relatively optimistic. So if they survive, most SMEs actually expect to create jobs in the next 5 years. And what you see here, everything that's blue is net job creation, so more jobs in 5 years' time than they currently have. But you also see that, and that's the gray parts of the columns, there is, for quite some SMEs, an expected drop in employment or no change. Overall, though, I think there's hope if we have policy measures in place to get SMEs through the next months, as it were, the next year, so help them survive in the short term, then there is much potential there for the future. And these job growth expectations really matter. You might think they are, just wishful thinking. No, we actually know from research in the UK, in the last recession, these job growth expectations then predicted subsequent actual job growth and also innovation and exporting of SMEs. If I could have the next slide, please. And what we found in all our various analyses was that one aspect was really important for predicting all sorts of positive outcomes, including longer expected survival of the SMEs, higher entrepreneurs' well-being, and also higher job growth expectations. And that was when the SMEs actually started out in the crisis to look out for new opportunities. So we already heard about the importance of opportunities, and here we see really robust evidence that that really matters. It's a coping mechanism, and it kind of seems maybe contrary to, we know that in a crisis, people try and focus on the here and now and on the survival. So it's really good news that we saw quite a lot of entrepreneurs trying to engage with changing their business and seeing new opportunities. If I can have the next slide, please. And so what were those opportunities? Just to give you some examples, perhaps unsurprisingly, there was a lot around digitalization, so a real push to engage with that. There was a lot of opportunities around health and well-being, both in terms of engaging with the heightened demand for medical supplies, but also actually well-being in terms of safeguarding their own and their employees' mental health, or seeing this as a wider business opportunity to deliver services in that area. We've already heard about the trend from global business to more local, in particular, kind of the desire to build up more local supply chains. There was a real push towards more sustainability, more circular economy, and more generally that the crisis was seen by quite a substantial share of the entrepreneurs in our study as really an opportunity to reposition the business and even redo the business model. And what can we see there? So some of this is, I'm sure, enabled by providing liquidity and finance to the entrepreneurs, but I think policy could do more. Policy could nudge entrepreneurs to actually actively exploit such opportunities and go out and look for opportunities, so to speak. And one way of how that could happen could be, for instance, through COVID opportunity vouchers. There is a scheme that's called innovation vouchers, which work fairly well. They've been evaluated with randomized randomized control trials. And something similar would seem to be quite helpful. So small cash grants that either allow the SMEs directly to conduct smart experiments, to explore new markets, test new product services, or to help them get business advice to kind of facilitate that. And it would help, it wouldn't be necessarily extremely costly, but it would send a signal that entrepreneurs need to engage with the kind of new reality, if you want, and kind of encourage them to change in this reality. And of course, there is something to be said for enabling digitalization. I don't want to repeat, all my esteemed colleagues have touched on this in one way or another. Just to say two things here, digitalization is clearly also a way to build a greener and more inclusive economy, because it also helps to include those who may be more distant or more remote, either socially or regionally. But I think the big stumbling block here is for the SMEs who haven't already engaged with that, they probably need more frugal solutions, because it's really difficult when you haven't engaged to kind of get your head around the legal ramifications. And also, you don't need a super sophisticated IT infrastructure. You need good enough frugal infrastructures. And if I could have my last slide, please. And this is just to say that basically, sometimes there is already, as Maya Göppel said, there is already more potential for a change than you might think. And I'd like to think this kind of slide speaks to that. I do honestly think there is a lot of potential for a more inclusive post-COVID economy. The previous slide had issues around sustainability on it already. But what we also see is that during the crisis, there was a real upswing in SME societal engagement. So they volunteered their business services and products in for good causes, and for half of them, that was actually newly triggered by the pandemic. So we know from broader research that SMEs are perhaps more engaged in their communities and in good causes than we might already think. And what we see here is that the pandemic strengthened that conviction. And this is all on top of personal volunteering and charitable giving that they're already doing as well. So there is much to kind of start us off into the more inclusive post-COVID economy. The last slide. Just to say thank you very much, and there's much more to come, and we're obviously tracing SMEs, and yeah, that's all there's to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ute Stephan. And now we move on to our Q&A section to the professors. So please send in your questions to us, give us your name and who you're directing the question to. I might ask the professors to keep the questions as brief as possible, because we are getting a good few coming in. We'd like to get to as many as possible, obviously. Now, a few in so far to Friederike Welter. You mentioned a diversity of SMEs. Do you think that diversity in governance matters, Friederike?
Yes, I do, because we see that in Germany as well. What is understood as Mittelstand businesses often is thought to include only old established family businesses, while we also say Mittelstand actually includes solo entrepreneurs, it includes self-employed, free professions, etc., etc. And what connects all of them is they have diversity in governance, but they are also responsible for the outcomes of their entrepreneurial activities. So it's diversity, and at the same time, it's a unique characteristics of these small enterprises. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks for your brevity there as well. Another question to anyone, so whoever wants to take this, any of the professors, do you think that the role of SMEs in society has changed over the last 2 decades, and in which way? And that comes from Maria Benedetta. Anyone like to take that one? Friederike, the floor is yours again.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to dominate the discussions. Yes, it has changed, or maybe we should say our awareness of what constitutes contributions of SMEs and their contribution to society has changed, because we initially had only the awareness, it's the economic aspects of what they contribute that matters. And what has actually gained prominence is that they have societal effects in their own, coming back to the example of solo entrepreneurs who do not contribute jobs jobs beyond their own jobs, but they contribute an awareness of society that each and every entrepreneurial activity matters.
Thank you, Friederike. Again, this is to anyone. We know none of us know how long COVID-19 restrictions will last. Even if successful vaccines are available in the new year, it really won't be till spring or late into next year before restrictions are removed. So what assumptions should businesses make now? And that to any of the professors. Anyone wish to take that question? Friederike, would you like to maybe take that question? I'm sure it's something that all of our delegates are wondering, you know, what assumptions need to be made now if we're not going to see a vaccine or restrictions taken away by the end of next year? Go ahead.
Well, if we want, I can...
Professor de Massis, yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, one important thing is, of course, there will be lots of uncertainty and we don't know how long it will going to last. But one important message is that this is the time now for business leaders to show to all their stakeholders that they are not really only looking at economic and financial aspects. I think, the non-economic and societal aspects will pay an important attention, and this is now the time where business leaders of SMEs can really show that. What we call sometimes social-emotional wealth, for example, all these non-economic utilities that can be accumulated when business leaders and owners achieve goals that can be goals for society, can be goals for families, can be goals of any kind of non-economic goals, will play a very important role. And I think, when things are uncertain, like they are now, having strong values, having, non-economic aspects at the core of their activity becomes especially important, because your values, your ethics in doing business becomes a sort of compass through which you can direct, the action of the different stakeholders.
Thank you very much, Professor de Massis. And this is a question in for Professor Ute Stephan. This comes in from the founder of New Mittelstand. What do you think, Professor, is digitalization good or bad for sustainability development and SMEs?
Very good question. I think, you can always see downsides and upsides to everything, but generally I think digitalization is something that's unavoidable, that is coming our way, and it's something that SMEs have to engage with, and there is loads of opportunities if they engage with it the right way to grow their business.
Thank you very much. And I'll give this question to any of you that might like to take it, otherwise I'll direct it from Panicus, who's a professor in entrepreneurship and family business in Cyprus. Can we introduce policy measures like taxation, for example, to regulate giants violating principles of circular economics, which gives them unfair socio-economic advantages and also damages our planet? Professor Aldrich, would you like to maybe take that question?
Oh, I would be delighted to take that question. Yes.
Thank you.
That was my answer.
Oh, that's your answer. Okay, you don't want to wish to elaborate. Okay, no problem.
No, I think the answer is can we use taxes and other types of I presume economic incentives, regulations to provide the right incentives to for firms to engage in sustainable strategies, sustainable decision making? And the answer is absolutely. That's what an enlightened policy. In fact, you could call that's what sustainable. That's at the core of sustainability policy.
Okay, another question to all of you again. Many SMEs took loans to see them through the first wave. To what extent are they able to do the same in the second wave? Or does that look different now, or will it look different in the future?
This is maybe I
Yes,
can...
go ahead. Thank you, Professor Stephan.
So just is a real concern and something that we see in our data. The entrepreneurs literally saying that I've now maxed out all my, so the self-employed saying we maxed out all my private credit cards. I don't know what to do next if there is another wave, and now there is another wave. And similarly, if you have, taken out loans the first wave, there was real concerns what happens next in now and over Christmas. So I think one idea could be to delay the repayment of loans, and some governments have already done this, and maybe even think further that SMEs only have to repay once they reach a certain profitability threshold again. But certainly, because a lot of loans have been taken out, there seems to be space for possible cash grants as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. Another really interesting question just come in there. We may see as many as 10% of SMEs go out of business in the next few months. Should governments maintain protection against creditors and liquidation, or start to let them go? Very difficult question, undoubtedly. Professor Selko, would you maybe like to take that one?
Well, I mean, this is a difficult one. I mean, many SMEs are, SMEs were bankrupting previously, and they are bankrupting now for various reasons, and reasons might be different, as long as there is sort of the critical mass of SMEs for the reasons that Frederica also mentioned. Then I think we should be fine, and due to the changing business models, due to the many aspects, many adaptations that are needed to survive in this time, we can for sure expect anyway that many SMEs will cease operations, and hopefully new SMEs will come and replace them. We did a survey recently. We published a paper on entrepreneur orientation. Basically, for those who do not know, it links innovativeness, proactivity, and risk taking, and those that has higher entrepreneur orientation, those SMEs or companies in general would also be better performers. And our research clearly shows that constructive risk taking is the only aspect that directly influences the performance. So those that will be able to take constructive risks will probably also be better performers. So that is what all my recent research at least suggests.
Thank you very much, Professor. And I might just ask Professor Outridge, for your, maybe just to wind this up, what would your message to an SME now dealing with the COVID crisis be?
Well, first of all, it would be to remember one of the main messages of Friederike Welter, who said, it's hard to generalize about SMEs other than their size. Even there's a lot of heterogeneity because they're so different. That's what makes talking about the subject so intriguing and challenging, because they're very heterogeneous. They're very diverse and different. But I think one common theme, one common message takeaway is to take this crisis as a catalyst for change, as an opportunity to move into the future. Don't try to preserve the past, because the future is going to come, and we know after the crisis. I mean, we all look forward to things returning to normal, but they're not going to go backwards. They're going to move into a future that's going to be shaped to a large part by the bolder, more enabling SMEs.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. That's probably the right message really to end that segment. Thank you very much for all your time and your insights, and I'm sure our delegates got a lot from that section. So thank you very much again. Now we're going to digest everything we've just heard, and I'm very happy to welcome on stage Kristin Schreiber. She's Director of SME Policy at DG Growth. You're very welcome to the stage. And of course, we have on the line there as well, we have Tim Lagerpusch, co-founder of Sugar Trends, and our own Maya Goppel from earlier on. You're welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us again. Kristin, from a policymaker's perspective, how do you go about solving the challenges we face? I mean, if you look, I suppose, listen to all the challenges we've heard about over the past day and a half. So I suppose in a nutshell, what's your sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks, Shona. I think, first of all, I would really like to say that it was great to have such a wonderful lineup of experts. And I think it was interesting to see that all the different complementary aspects, so some common ground, but also, I mean, everybody putting in their specific focus. I mean, you know that we had adopted in March this year our SME strategy for the new Commission, basically, which was the guiding principle for the mandate to come. And then 2 days later came COVID. And I think what I would like to highlight is that while, of course, we had to adjust and fine-tune, I think the fundamental challenges identified, like the issue of transiting to digitization, to sustainability, I think have actually become, if anything, more important than ever. And I think what we have seen, what also came over very clearly in the debate, is that we really need to look at the wider picture. We have to take a systemic approach, as Maya Göppel put it. I would call it holistic approach, that we really look at the future, at seeing that how we think we all realize we cannot just go back to the status quo ante. We have to help our SMEs bounce forward in a different way, and also, I would say, learn and use these benefits from the crisis. So that's, I would say, the approach that we are having. And I think it's very, very interesting to see what has been developed in the Systemic Change Compass. It's interesting to point out that Janusz Potocznik, who was one of the co-authors, was actually our speaker at last year's assembly. So I think we already had a good nose then in which direction I think things should move. And let me just say conclude by saying that I think we can sort of put the framework, we can help companies overcome barriers, overcome regulatory obstacles, try to become more sustainable, but of course, everything has to be then implemented by companies. So, and I hope that's what we're trying to do, to provide the right framework, I would say, for a different approach and for SMEs to bounce back.
Well, thank you very much for your initial assessment, Kristen. And for any delegates who'd like to ask a question of Kristen, of Tim, of Maya, please do so and send that in to us. Tim, I'll just go to you next. How do you encourage innovation against a background of crisis and climate change?
Just maybe one sentence about me. I'm Tim Lagerpusch, 43 years old, based in Cologne, an entrepreneur. Since long, also studied industrial engineering and management at the university, already a very holistic approach of university degree of business, technology, and engineering, and also IT. And I started a company 2014, it's called Sugar Trends, a marketplace for small micro companies across Europe. Into one digital network and enabling them to digitalize, so also like push them or make it attractive for them to become innovative, and also started an entrepreneurship startup incubator at the university in Karlsruhe, at technical university, and saw a lot of startup teams. So my approach of pushing for innovation is, especially in this crisis, like keep the people, like the companies, from sudden death with financial aid and also some public aid, but also really take care that you don't want to disengage them from creativity, and really keep the long-term future and keep our sustainability goals. That's important. Even if we have now it's midterm, but it's actually a short-term pandemic crisis, and there's a lot of other crises parallel around.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. Finally, Maya, on this part, how do we go about creating new business models for a sustainable European economy?
Well, I think I've looked through the chat as well, the kind of remarks that came back in the morning session. And I think one element there was really about how do we put the balance sheet right so that value creation is accounted for in a more diversified way. And that means the social positive impacts and the environmental positive impacts. So through changing business practice, you're investing in the regeneration of your environment, by the way. And then it should also be accounted for to really make sure that that is becoming part of not only the non-financials, but the financials. And there is a lot of work going on right now in the kind of context of value balancing. And since there were questions about B corporations and if small and medium-sized enterprises should become this as well, It is the whole idea to really just show your full impact. And I think a lot of SMEs would fare really well, because things that are looked at there is the job ratio. So how many jobs are you creating? And we've seen a lot of that it was more the smaller and not the biggest companies that are maintaining high degrees of apprenticeships, for example. And now we've seen the examples in the other talks about who keeps workers on board longer. So this whole embedding in the community, the taxes were mentioned, so that you have something like a feeling of being a corporate citizenship or entrepreneur citizenship attached to it. And all of that could become much more clear when you do the value balancing differently. And then you have a really good groundwork for arguing for policy changes, arguing for investment adjustments, so that this kind of more holistic accounting, and thus showing what is the real impact from a holistic point of view, can make it easier for those companies to compete with others. And I think this is exactly where some of the issues of the Green Deal are looking at. So the reporting, the accounting, the incentives, then the support programs that come.
Thank you very much, Maya. And I just say, for delegates, please do send in your questions for Tim or Maya or Kristen. Kristen, one question's coming in for you. You're obviously Director of SME Policy at DG Grow. And one question came in saying, there'll be many workers losing their jobs and requiring retraining and reskilling. How should policymakers anticipate what the demand for skills should be? And should they simply just push to digital skills and the green economy, because that seems the most obvious one? Or what advice would you give?
Yeah, of course, that's, a crucial issue already before the crisis, and it has become even more acute now. I think it's now common knowledge that you don't actually learn a profession or study a topic and then you will work for the rest of your life in that area. I think we already knew that beforehand. So it's all about, in a way, individual skills and skill set to be able to find a good place on the labor market. And I think we have to look at two types of skill set where also the public sector has to help. One are sort of more horizontal skills, like digital skills. And here, of course, the COVID crisis has played a tremendous job in basically making everybody realize that these digital skills are needed. And we have all kinds of programs. We have in our SME strategy a digital volunteer program to help SMEs. And I think this is really a very crucial aspect. Same horizontally for sustainability. It's important that every single company has a sort of sustainability assessment, that you actually go through what you can make more sustainable in terms of process, and this actually requires skills for the workers. And then you have certain sectors, and we're working actually very much, you have seen the skills pact, which was launched very recently, on also working together in specific sectors on improving and enhancing the skill sets of workers. So I think you need an approach coming from different ends to make sure that this works out, both for the individual, which is very important, but of course also for companies and society as a whole.
Thank you very much, Kristen. Tim, question coming in for you. Larger businesses are embracing sustainability reporting. Can SMEs do the same?
Yeah, I think it's super important point, and also to place your focus on this. But then it comes to the point of resource limitation when you're a very small team and you have so many things to do, and then there's also a lot of regulation in place and new regulation in place to prevent consumers for cheating that companies need to obey. And then same in our small team and company and startup team, there's so many things to do that you have a lot of things on your wish list that you really want to do, and then you find yourself not being able to do this. Also, I'm involved now in a older plastics production company as a consultant for the big transformation to a green and sustainable future of that company group with 8 factories across Europe. And I see the same there. There's also limited resources, but they have more resources. And then it's a term of focus and skill set of the existing people. So I think some support of how to do it, and also place some support in there of being able to do this. And the one would be the responsibility reporting or sustainability reporting. And the other focus that I see right now with the focus of the pandemic crisis now is when I keep asking other businessmen do they do some scenario analysis of the future, like how does the market develop and how can they react? that most of them didn't do. They just, many of them wait and say, when will be my numbers, my sales, like 2019? And then to be able to go from there, and the thinking of going into scenario analysis now would be very important, and some sort of, I think there is possibility for more experience exchange and also some resources that companies could use for helping them to go the right way and get some approaches and some tool sets to be able to use them themselves, but get into these tool sets.
Thank you, Tim. Maya, you're nodding your head there. What do you have to say about that? And is it possible for small SMEs embrace sustainability reporting, particularly at this, very difficult time when, they're doing so many other things?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this, for me, would be exactly one of the points where cooperation would be key. And since we've been talking about credits versus grants, it's been a big discussion there. How can you expect, especially in some sectors, for credits to be repaid? people can't eat more than a few meals a day. So how are restaurants going to be able to catch up again after the crisis to pay that back? So this notion of grant giving for those that have been shut down, had no possibility to make an income, has been an important element in there. And I'm very glad the EU came around to supporting that kind of grant giving as well. What you could obviously align with it, and we've been talking about it in the context of fairs, for example, because they're really creating so much waste and so much pollution. Lots of what is being constructed for one fair for 3-4 days is going to be dumped, and it's piles and piles of dumped. So how could, during this period when transfers are being paid for this short-term Kurzarbeitergeld, what we call it, so the compensation for wages from the government, still offer the kind of training, still incentivize that right now you can rebuild the production chain and get all the elements going that, for example, when you revamp and reboot the fairs, that they're going to be having recycled materials pop up that can be dismantled and put up somewhere else, so that you rebuild the whole way that you've been delivering a kind of service or an infrastructure from a much more sustainable point of view. So how can transfer of money and transfer of skills and this kind of support, what Tim was alluding to, be combined? And for me, the analogy would be in the Just Transition agenda. And it was really good to see in the EU program on Just Transition, which is for regions, right? Like whole regions and other regions where the entire infrastructure has to change and business models will go away, to not only give money, but to have a governance support scheme. So to bring the skills in, to bring the support in, and to bring people in that are trained in process management. Because you can't do everything. And if you focus on doing what is required, you need help from someone that can tell you and support you with how change can happen, which also makes it easier for you to do it internally.
Thanks, Maya. Just, you mentioned grants and loans there. To what extent are financial markets making sustainable financing available to SMEs? That's another question that's come in.
Well, I think it's good that we do look at what finance is doing and are trying with the taxonomy and other impulses. And Europe is certainly leading when you compare it internationally. But when you look at it in an honest way, the amount of finance that is actually trying to go for ESG, so environmental, social governance aspects, is really small in comparison to the huge amounts that are absolutely, well, if I want to be friendly, agnostic, if not ignorant, towards sustainability impact. And then you have a huge difference between Europe and in the US, for example, pension funds are not allowed to compromise the financial return on investment due to ESG considerations. So there's a huge regulatory issue there that needs to be tackled, a huge issue about shadow banking. And I think the increasing financialization, so the dominance and the influence of a financial sector on what companies can do, is something that we really have to put a check on, because it was supposed to be that liquidity is serving the real economy. And quite often now we see that the interest of financial capital is dictating what real productive business can actually do.
Thanks, Maya. And I might just put this question to you, Tim. It comes from Morella Kochi. What kind of support is needed to be offered to SMEs due to the pandemic situation? Are financial inputs enough?
The first thing is like the short-term work, and also the financial aids and loans was very important measure. The issue is, what I saw is that it took so long until it, like from saying on the news we do it, and for the companies of getting these financial grants took very long and takes until today. So for us in our business model, we are still not profitable and on the growth path, and we have an issue that our marketplace of the small boutiques is very needed in this moment of digitalizing the small and distributed retail. Same time, we are not profitable and we need further funding, and our investors that we looked in were putting on the brakes and to say, oh, we need to save the money, or we are not sure of investing. So we are in this financing issue of having more growth on e-commerce, and the model makes sense, but it's still not in itself sustainable. So, and also these financial aid systems were not made for us in the beginning. Then I really want to pronounce the skill sets and to embrace more networking and look further than just this pandemic. Helps a lot, and also keeping the market diverse, and keep the opportunities and further than now, and keep having creative companies and creative individuals, and not pampering them too much with aids prevents then creative or disruptive change. And also you need some disruption now. When we talk about sustainability, we also have a lot of overflow of consumption products in the market, and it actually needs some sort of production to die and some providers to die and to reassemble. And it's a really tough moment, and you don't want to have everyone unemployed at the same time and looking for new jobs same time, and prevent it a bit, but then also let it happen and embrace our what we now see as a purposeful future. And one last point is, it's maybe even getting beyond the how to help the SMEs right now, but it's when we make it favorable to ask questions, how are things made, and to have it favorable to get things from small companies and have customer relationships with small companies, and also teaching the young crowd, teaching the kids that this is not more for the long-term approach, now we are still in this business system that when you cheat and when you find the gaps and gray zones, this is then giving you profits. And so all the companies, also existing small and big companies, say always, if the competitor doesn't become completely sustainable and spend so much for green future, then I have to wait until they do. Because if I do now, then they have bigger margin and I don't. So make it more addressable to not cheat and have it in the culture to really honor the honest people. This is, for me, one very important point for teaching the youth and bringing it more and more into the culture to really look into the details and also take questions.
Thanks very much, Tim. I think we've got time for another question, because there's a very interesting one here from Cheryl Miller Van Dyke, who's the Director of Digital Leadership Institute. I might just put this to you, Kristen. Is there a policy priority for bringing a larger number of Europe's women into the tech-enabled and tech-driven entrepreneurship fold in order to address this double whammy affecting women, which is underrepresentation in tech and in SME leadership, in order really to build back better? That comes from Cheryl Miller Van Dyke.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think we can, let's say we have to have an inclusive approach, and I think we have a chance of everybody can build a more resilient future for SMEs, whether men or women. But I mean, jokes apart, we do indeed have a very important, diversity policy. And I would say this is across all boards. I mean, whether you take classical SME policy, we had a very good panel yesterday, I think, which discussed many issues on female entrepreneurship. But of course, also this very particular issue, which I think the question refers to, which is the point of women in tech. And here we are supporting very much female business angel networks. And this is, a very important point where you need role models, where you need active also support. And we have been working on this. And I think this is one contribution to making things more sustainable in the long run.
I might just put that question to you, Maya, as well, in relation to women being underrepresented in SME and in the tech sector. Is there policy that could address that double whammy?
Well, I think for me, part of rethinking where we want to go is to really look at what is work in our societies, because there we do see the big squeeze, and we've seen it in the pandemic a lot, that it was the family work that was primarily, I'm not saying everywhere, but primarily then done by women again. And we have seen studies about the publication intensity, for example, in female professors versus male professors. And we've seen who's taking down work time in order to look after the children when they can't go to childcare or school. And it's typically been women, because they tend to work, unless it was system relevant jobs, obviously, which was for the first time now, some of the care work that tends to be much worse in terms of wages than other sectors. So I think there's a correction for income so that we allow for a more just equilibration of who's doing how much work. And then we also need work time flexibility. And it's one of the things that studies come out a lot with from UK, with some 60% that say they don't want to necessarily go back for the full-time work. This will allow to have less pressure of needing to create full-time jobs. It would ease us a bit away from having to continue with the overproduction that Tim mentioned. So we really have to look at work and what is the intensity of work, what is the working hours, what are the activities that we want to consider work, and how can they get compensated, and how can we make sure that every contribution to having a cohesive and socially well supported society, talking about the system relevant jobs, is enabling people to do both and have the kind of safety network with which they can become creative. So for me, this whole notion about enabling women is a family aspect in a lot of places, and it's a cultural aspect in other places. But overall, we need to really look at enabling structures for family ways of engaging and for lowering the work time on those that also have care work to do.
Thanks very much, Maya. And this comes in from the SME United president. And I'll just address it to Tim. It's an interesting one. Could you say more about the role of the entrepreneur, and what should his or her perfect profile be?
There is not a perfect profile. It's very diverse. Like, what's the base of an entrepreneur is to find the gap. It's the word of the entrepreneur to find a possible niche where you can do, like, create value, and someone is willing to give you a margin on top of what you did for him, like for this created value. But then to be a leader and a role model, and also to be fully responsible for your team is very important, and to stand there and also tell I not say truth and be transparent, but have your agenda and keep your people with you and create trust in the network around you. So there's a lot of also happening of, I would say, SMEs that are not family owned and not entrepreneur owned, that are owned by other funds or have just temporary managers in there. And there I see often a behavior that they have very limited agenda of a future of just next 4 or 5 years and don't care so much of the time beyond. And sometimes also don't stand with their complete person and to complete trustability in there, and don't create so much trust, or jump in their value chains of companies, whether they get suppliers or whether they have customers, and have a lot of fast changes of customer and supplier structures just for small changes of prices. And I think to creating stronger networks and stronger partnerships into all directions. And it starts with this, like, the entrepreneur. And the entrepreneur should also not sit there and say, no one helps me, it's crisis, no one helps me. The entrepreneur should be there and find solutions. And it's good when there's some sort of aid and help systems around that you can make use. And it's also for the whole society very important right now to have not a total collapse and spiral down. But I want to have creative entrepreneurs who don't look for solutions and look for solutions for the problems, and don't sit there and cry or wait or search the problem somewhere else. Like, it's you in your surrounding, you can make it going. Okay. And if it's also a lot about the failing, what we saw over the last years, also the more events around talk about your failures and talk about your faults. And what's important in our society and economy is that for entrepreneurs, we make it easy to restart again. Like, even if you fail, that you have possibility to get it going.
Okay, thank you.
And look at it and say you failed.
Thank you very much, and they're very strong words. Just final question, Christian, to you as Director of Policy for SMEs at DG Grow. We've got a comment here from Sylvie Klein-Franca. Would innovation vouchers to connect between like-minded small enterprises be a good additional support, I suppose, or would be something that could be considered that you think is practical, perhaps?
Sure, I think this is one of the many sort of elements one can promote in terms of supporting businesses in making transition, making changes. I mean, we have our Enterprise Europe network, which is the biggest SME support network in the world, which provides targeted advice on innovation, on sustainability, on finding market opportunities. And these kind of innovation vouchers, provided it is done with low, I would say, administrative impact, because sometimes, I mean, I think you have to make sure that it's easy to manage. I think that this can be an interesting component into this global, I would say, approach.
Thank you very much, Kristen. And thank you to you, Tim, and to Maya as well.